The County class was a class of heavy cruisers built for the Royal Navy in the years between the First and Second World Wars. They were the first post-war cruiser construction for the Royal Navy and were designed within the limits of the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. Such ships, with a limit of 10,000 tons, standard displacement and 8-inch caliber main guns may be referred to as treaty cruisers. The 13 counties were built in 3 distinct subclasses, the Kent, London and Norfolk classes. They were the only 10,000-ton 8-inch gun, or 8 cruisers that the Royal Navy built. The counties are remembered for their distinctive 3-funnel layout and service in all the major naval theaters of the Second World War. In an attempt to extract more ships from the treaty limits, the Navy planned to construct 8,250-ton B ships, 6 of which could be built in place of 5 counties. The extra ship that this afforded was an attractive proposition for a Navy that had the immense peacetime commitments of empire. In the event, peacetime economies and politics intervened and only 2 B-type cruisers were built, an 8-inch gun-modified county design, the York class. In 1929, the mean cost of each A ship was estimated to be £2,180,000, whilst the mean cost of each B ship was estimated to be £1,800,000. Conflictingly, the cost per ship in 1924 was said to be approximately £950,000. Design and AMP development. The 10,000-ton treaty cruisers were the first type of warships built to internationally agreed restrictions. These restrictions posed new engineering challenges and forced compromises upon designers in how to extract the best balance of speed, armament and protection. The United States Navy adopted a design with triple gun turrets, allowing the hull to be shortened, thus saving weight that could be put into protection. This approach, however, was at the expense of requiring increased installed power, as the speed of a ship is a function of the ratio of length to beam. The Royal Navy had a requirement for a vessel for colonial trade route defense, which required a good cruising range in speed and independent fighting power. This determined the need for a long hull and the use of 4 twin-gun turrets, with any remaining displacement invested in protection. The design was conservative in nature, especially when compared to the contemporary Nelson-class battleships built to satisfy the same treaty. The long hull was flush-decked and with a high freeboard, and was strongly built. This afforded high initial stability, which contributed to the protection scheme. The machinery spaces followed the traditional layout of boiler rooms ahead of engine rooms, separated by an amidships magazine. The 2 boiler rooms exhausted into 4 uptakes, the central pair being combined to form a thickened central funnel. The 3-funnel design was handsome, but somewhat impractical in terms of utilization of internal space, as had been trusted in the wartime cruiser HMS Emerald, whose completion had been delayed post-war. The counties featured a new design of forward superstructure incorporating the navigating bridge, wheelhouse, signaling and compass platforms and gunnery director in a single block. This advance considerably rationalized the separate armored conning tower and myriad of decks and platforms of older designs. Moving the fire control equipment from the mast negated the need for a heavy tripod, and light pole masts sufficed for signaling yards and the spread of wireless antennae. Armament. The guns BL 8-inch Mark 8 were equally disposed in superfiring twin turrets fore and aft. The turret design was needlessly complicated by the original requirement that they should be capable of anti-aircraft fire and were thus provided with a maximum elevation of 70 degrees. Despite the inability to train and elevate sufficiently quickly to track aerial targets and the complete lack of a suitable fire control system, secondary armament consisted of 4 QF 4-inch Mark V guns in single mounts RMK. 3 fed from the amidships magazine. There were quadruple tube torpedo launches, 1 each side, amidships. The single 4-inch MKV guns were later replaced by Mk16 guns in paired mountings. In a fruitless attempt to keep within treaty limits, the Mark 16 mounting was stripped down to reduce the weight, the result being the Mark 17, an exercise described as ridiculous punctiliousness. They were later converted back to standard Mark 16 mounts. The initial design called for 2 octuple mountings for the QF 2-pounder Mk8 anti-aircraft autocannon, but as a weight-saving exercise these were not initially shipped, and the existing QF 2-pounder Mark II was carried in lieu on 4 single mounts. Space was provided for a rotating catapult and a crane for operating aircraft, although again these were initially not provided. Protection. The initial design left little weight to distribute amongst protection. Thus, the traditional side belt of armor was dispensed with, and the 1-inch side plating was sufficient to only give protection against shell splinters. A 1.25-inch protective deck covered the machinery spaces, and there were box citadels protecting the magazines and shell rooms. 2.5-inch crowns and 4-inch sides, closed by 2.5-inch bulkheads. The aft box citadel had slightly reduced thicknesses at the ends, and the citadel amidships had thinner armor as it lay within the confines of the armored deck and side plating. There was a 1.5-inch arch over the steering gear closed by a 1-inch thick forward bulkhead. The turrets and barbets received only thin splinter plating, as did the compass platform. There were external bulges to provide torpedo protection. Differences and modifications. Kent Class. The initial 7 ships, Berwick, Cornwall, Cumberland, Kent, and Suffolk, and HMAS Australia and HMAS Canberra for the Royal Australian Navy, formed the Kent Class. All were ordered in 1924 and commissioned in 1928. It was quickly found necessary to heighten the funnels by some 15 feet to clear the flue gases. For the aft superstructure, the Australian ships, Australia and Canberra, had them raised a further 3 feet. Between 1930 and 1933 the aircraft and catapult were added, as was a high-angle HACS director for the 4-inch guns. Kent received an additional pair of 4-inch guns in 1934, and she, Berwick and Cornwall each received a pair of QF 0.5-inch Vickers machine guns added abreast the fore-funnel. By the mid-1930s, the British Kents were due for modernization. However, there was little surplus weight for the designers to work with while remaining within the treaty requirements. They were between 150 and 250 tons under the treaty limits, and it was estimated that a further 200-odd tons could be gained through various savings. A 6-foot deep armored belt, 4.5-inch thick, was added amidships, extending down from the armored deck to 1 foot below the waterline. Cumberland and Suffolk had the aft superstructure raised and replaced by a large hangar for 2 aircraft and affixed athwartship's catapult. A crane was fitted on either side of the after funnel, and the rear gunnery, navigation and control positions were relocated to the hangar roof. The single 2-pounder guns were removed and quadruple mountings, Mark VII, were added on either side of the bridge. The 4-inch guns were relocated, and the rearmost pair were replaced by twin mountings Mark 19 for the QF 4-inch Mark 16. To keep weight within acceptable margins, the hull was cut down by one deck aft of Y turret. Berwick and Cornwall were similarly converted, but with more weight in hand. The hull was not cut down. All four 4-inch mounts were twins, and the 2-pounder guns were octuple mounts. By 1939, the torpedo tubes had been removed in all four ships. Kent had less weight available for improvements and therefore was not given such an extensive modernization. While she received the 4-inch armor belt and the double 4-inch gun mounts like her sisters, she retained the rotating catapult and after superstructure, with an additional fire control position mounted on a distinctive lattice structure aft. Her anti-aircraft armaments were improved as for her sisters, but the multiple 2-pounders and the directors were carried aft by the lattice structure. Naval historian H. Trevor Lenton estimates that despite the best attempts, none of these ships stayed within the treaty limits. Kent's full-load displacement was 14,197 tons, indicating a standard displacement of around 10,600 tons. Lenton expresses doubts whether the Admiralty ever informed the government of these excesses, as with war imminent, there were more pressing demands on the time. London Class. The second group, the four ships of the London Class, closely followed the design of the Kents. The external bulges were not present, reducing the beam by 2 feet, and the hull was lengthened by 2 feet 9 inches. These changes translated into a 3/4 knot increase in speed. To remedy the loss of the bulge protection, there was a second skin of inner plating to provide the same effect. The bridge was moved aft to lessen the effects of muzzle blast from B-turret when the guns were trained abaft the beam. They had heightened funnels as built. The aircraft and catapult had been fitted by 1932. In all ships bar Sussex, 4 4-inch guns were added in single mountings abreast the funnels. The single 2-pounder guns were removed, and 2 quadruple mounts for 0.5-inch Vickers machine guns were added. Shropshire acquired an additional anti-aircraft fire control director. Early in the war, the additional 4-inch guns were removed, and the original 4-inch guns altered to the Mark 16 twin mounts. The octuple 2-pounder guns that had originally been designed in were also finally added. From 1938 to 1941, London received an altogether more comprehensive modernization. Her upperworks were removed and replaced by new fore and aft superstructures and 2 upright funnels modeled on the contemporary Crown Colony class cruisers. The forward superstructure block incorporated a large hangar opening onto an athwartship's catapult between the superstructure blocks. There was a catapult on either side of the after funnel. The 4-inch anti-aircraft guns were replaced by twin mountings and relocated to the after superstructure, with the torpedoes a deck below. The 2-pounder guns were carried on the hangar roof and the multiple Vickers guns mounted, one each, on the roofs of B and X turrets. A 3.5-inch belt, 8 feet deep, was added abreast the machinery spaces, extending up to the armored deck. However, the hull had originally been carefully designed to reduce weight based on the initial arrangements. The modifications to London added heavy weights fore and aft and severely overstressed the hull. As a result, cracks and loose rivets began to appear on the upper deck. The upper deck was reinforced, which caused the stress to be transmitted through the lower hull instead, and cracks began to appear under the waterline. It took underwater reinforcements and refits extending into 1943 to remedy the situation. The outbreak of war prevented what had ended up being a rather fruitless cosmetic rebuild being extended to the rest of her sisters, as had originally been intended. The remaining Londons thus never received side armouring of the improved aircraft complement. During wartime refits, the last three Londons underwent similar alterations as the Kents did, having their 8 21-inch torpedo tubes removed, and X 8-inch turret removed, although both London and Shropshire retained it. Shropshire, unlike her two unconverted sisters, retained her torpedo armament, and was transferred to the Royal Australian Navy in early 1943 to replace Canberra. Norfolk Class. The final pair of counties, Norfolk and Dorsetshire, formed the Norfolk Class. Another two ships that had been deferred from the 1927-8 and 1928-9 programs, to have been named Northumberland and Surrey, were ordered on 15 May 1929, but suspended on 23 August and finally cancelled on 14 January 1930. This was due to the change in administration in 1929 that ushered in a minority Labour government under Ramsay MacDonnell. The new government cancelled the ships as an economy measure and as a gesture to the forthcoming London Naval Conference. The Norfolks were repeats of the Londons with minor alterations. The bridge and after superstructure were lowered. The 8-inch gun turrets were Mark II variants that were intended to offer weight savings, but ended up being heavier than the Mark I variant. The 4-inch guns were relocated forwards in order that they did not obstruct the catapult and aircraft which had been mounted lower down than in the predecessors. During 1937, the 4-inch guns were replaced by twins. Octuple 2-pounders were added around the after superstructure and the single guns forward were removed. These improvements pushed the standard displacement over 10,400 tons. The Surreys were a modified design, more heavily armored but 2 knots slower. During the war, rocket launchers were initially added, but they were later removed along with the Vickers guns. These were replaced by the altogether more useful 20mm Lycon gun. An additional director for the 4-inch guns was added, and the pole masts were replaced by tripods to support the additional weight of masthead electronics. Dorsetshire was sunk in 1942, and so it was only Norfolk that underwent a refit in 1944, during which her aircraft, catapult and X-turret were removed. This allowed for quadruple 2-pounder mounts and the directors and 4 single 40mm Bofors guns to be added. An extra superstructure was added aft to carry barrage directors, fitted with radar Type 283, which finally allowed the main armament to serve in its intended anti-aircraft role. Comparison of classes ** post-1935 refit, not in Canberra, ** post-1938 rebuild, London-only ships, service. The County class saw much service during the Second World War. Norfolk and Suffolk were equipped with radar which was used to good advantage when they shadowed the German battleship Bismarck during the RN's attempts to hunt her down after the sinking of HMS Hood. The class saw service in nearly every theatre of the war. Norfolk, Suffolk, and Dorsetshire were involved in the pursuit of Bismarck and Prince Eugen. Berwick fought gunnery action with the German cruiser Admiral Hipper, and Norfolk again fought German Navy surface units during Battle of the North Cape. Suffolk and Sussex suffered bomb damage from a Luftwaffe aircraft, and both required substantial repairs. 3 of the class were lost, with Canberra being hit by naval gunfire at the Battle of Savoy Island, then scuttled by U.S. destroyer, and Cornwall and Dorsetshire both bombed and sunk by Japanese carrier-borne aircraft during the Indian Ocean raid. The survivors began decommissioning in 1948, and were all decommissioned by the mid-1950s, except Cumberland, which was an armaments trials ship testing the automatic 6-inch and 3-inch guns that would be fitted to the Tiger class. She was scrapped in 1959. Canarias Class. Two ships based on the County Class P Canarias and Baleares of the Canarias class were designed in the UK and constructed in Spain by the Vickers Armstrong subsidiary Sociedad Española de Construcción Naval. Completed in the late 1930s for the Spanish Navy, they saw service during the Spanish Civil War. Although they shared a common hull, machinery and main armament, the Spanish ships had a notably different appearance, with an enormous single funnel, though Canarias received two funnels in a later refit, and an equally tall forward superstructure.